Hei. Jeg heter Kjersti Hegdal og er styremedlem I MIF Kristiansand. We're looking forward to listen to you again.
Thank you, Kjersti.
Hun prøvde å lære seg hvordan hun skulle uttale navnet mitt I går, så det må jeg...
Not bad, Kjersti. How's my accent?
Og nå skal hun snakke om kampen mot woke antisemitisme. Så dette tror jeg blir spennende. We're looking forward to hearing from you again.
Looking forward to being with you guys again. Didn't even start yet. So, good afternoon, everyone. It's me, again. I come to you not only as a defender of Israel and of Jewish rights, and as an activist, but as a voice for those whose stories are often untold. Stories of Jews like my family, who have roots in Arab lands, and whose experiences can shed light on the modern-day battle against anti-Semitism. Today, I want to take you on a journey, from my family's history to the broader history of anti-Semitism and its modern-day guise as anti-Zionism. The hatred that led to my family's persecution is a hatred that is intrinsically linked to anti-Zionism and to the woke anti-Semitism that we see today. So let me start with my family's personal story. My father, Eliyahu Miman Shimon Allen, was born in Morocco, a land where Jewish communities once thrived for centuries. The Jews in Morocco were there before the Islamic conquest, before the Islamic conquest, and lived amongst the Amazigh. He grew up in a vibrant neighborhood where Jews and Muslims lived side by side, sharing traditions, markets, and memories. He told me stories of the bustling souks, the scents of spices, and the melodies of the synagogue, and the blending with the call to mosque and the prayer. But as time went by, the harmony faded. History is most definitely not linear. Like every diaspora country, like everywhere the Jews resided, the host countries that Jews resided in have an expiry date. With the rise of pan-Arab nationalism and the establishment and the rebirth of Israel in 1948, my father's Jewish identity became a target. The very neighbors who once shared our family space began to see them as outsiders. By the time my father was 9 years old, his family had to leave everything behind. Their home, their businesses, their entire way of life. They ended up in Winnipeg with shorts on, with not much. Their luggage didn't even come. Simply because they were Jews. This isn't just my family story. It is a story of nearly 1 million Jews who were expelled or who fled from Arab lands and from Iran in the late 20th century. A lot of us hear about the Nakba narrative and the refugees and the refugee problem that has been created by UNRWA. But not a lot of people know about the Mizrahi Jews who are also refugees in the same period of time. And no one has spoken up for our rights, our dispossession, or the $1 billion of assets that have vanished. And I want to make a point through telling the story of a very revered figure for us as Moroccan Jews. Her name is Sulika Hatzadeket, Sulika the Righteous. The reason that I'm sharing Sulika's story is because history is not linear. I mentioned before that my father told me stories that were positive from Morocco. Of course, we know how the king protected Jews during the Holocaust, but there was still concentration camps in North Africa. There was still anti-Semitism. So it goes to show you that not everything is black or white. And oftentimes, anti-Zionists will try to present it that way, but it's not. So this brings me back to Sulika. Sulika resided in the city of Fez. Sulika is also a Jewish resistance fighter. Sulika resisted the Islamization of her identity in Morocco, and it costed her her life. Sulika was a very young, beautiful, and smart woman. She was known in her village for her intelligence, for her wisdom, and for her beauty. The chief of the village in Fez, wanted to marry her. He was Muslim. Sulika refused. She was in hiding. But he had his mindset. She refused to convert to Islam. She refused to give up her Jewish identity, and she refused to let go of her covenant that her people have been maintaining for thousands of years. The chief of the village did not like that very much. The story of Sulika is one of resistance. It is a sad story, but it is a story of power. Since Sulika did not comply, resisted the Islamization, she was sentenced to be dragged by a horse in the village that she came from to humiliate her. But in her final moments and the attempts to try to humiliate her, she sewed her clothes onto her body so that nothing would be seen. Today in Morocco, you can still visit Sulika's grave, and it mentions her story on the gravestone. Actually, my great-great-grandmother is buried in the same cemetery. Her name is Mazel Tov, and that's who my mother is named after. This story goes to show you that, yes, there was some okay times in Morocco when Jews were tolerated as dhimmis. Morocco was also the best of the worst, is the way I like to describe it. When the worst is Auschwitz, it's not exactly the standard you want to have to live in diaspora. So she resisted. I have now shared with you a brief story of my family and a little bit about how it was like in Morocco. And this is a reflection of the universal story of the Jew. It is a story of survival amid persecution and amid Jew hatred. So even though my family is just one among a million Jews around who are persecuted out of Arab lands for anti-Semitism, I want to make the point and emphasize that the brand of Jew hatred that caused the pogrom that we saw this week in Amsterdam, making Jews, trying to force them to eliminate an element of their identity, their national component of their identity, is the same brand of anti-Semitism that forced the Jews out of Arab lands. It is the brand of anti-Semitism we see on college campuses, and the same one from that lynch mob in Amsterdam that caused the mass exodus of Jews in Arab lands. Now, to go back in the mindset of Pan-Arabism at the time, to truly understand the relationship between this brand of anti-Zionism and how it's tied to woke left-wing anti-Semitism, let's take a quote from Egypt's delegate to the United Nations. In 1947, the Egyptian delegate to the UN told the General Assembly, and I quote, "The lives of 1 million Jews in Muslim countries will quickly be jeopardized by partition. This dire warning quickly became reality." What's interesting here is that left-wing anti-Semitism is predicated on this flaw. The flaw that the Egyptian delegate tried to promote at the UN. The flaw that Jews are to blame for the hate that we face. The flaw that Jews are facing anti-Semitism because you're a Zionist, because of Israel. That could not be further from the truth. Because to be a Jew is to be a Zionist. The exception is not the rule. And when I say Zionist, I mean someone who believes that Jews are connected to the land of Israel, someone who believes that Jews have the right to sovereignty in the land of Israel. This is a belief that is ingrained in Jewish philosophy. Every day we pray towards Jerusalem. Every day when we read the Amidah prayer, we pray for the rebuilding of Jerusalem. It is part of who we are. We're the people of Israel. We aren't just pro-Israel. We literally are Israel. The land is named after us. We are named after the land. So an integral part of Jewish identity is attacked when anti-Zionist Jews try to strip us of our identity. When anti-Zionists try to strip Jews of our identity, excuse me. So in order to understand woke anti-Semitism, left-wing anti-Semitism, we must first understand how anti-Semitism functions, the origins of anti-Semitism, and how ultimately left-wing anti-Semitism, although it seems different, functions the same. They didn't really reinvent the wheel. So let's get into the history of anti-Semitism. Let's dig a little deeper and understand the words that we are using. I'll start with the word anti-Semitism. Where does the word anti-Semitism even come from? Wilhelm Marr is known as the father of anti-Semitism. The term anti-Semitism was coined by Wilhelm Marr in the late 19th century. He didn't just hate Jews. He created a term that gave a pseudo-scientific justification to that hatred, casting Jews as an alien race, as a subhuman race that could never be a part of society. This ideology was in part fueled by the pogroms in Eastern Europe and eventually the Holocaust. The word anti-Semitism that Wilhelm Marr coined, he started a political party called the Anti-Semitic Party, is the word that we use today to describe Jew hatred as a whole. Before anti-Semitism, there was the word Judenhass, but that was too, as we say in French, arriéré, backwards. Now, in the age of Wilhelm Marr, the age of science, enlightenment, Jew hatred had mutated. Now Jew hatred was predicated on this new pseudoscience, Jews, the inferior race, the rat race, and we see a lot of that in Nazi beliefs and in Nazi propaganda. The late Jonathan Sacks explained that anti-Semitism is a virus that mutates. Rabbi Sacks calls anti-Semitism a Jew hatred. Rabbi Sacks calls anti-Semitism a mutating virus. I have determined that there are two tenets of this mutating virus that remain the same in every generation, and that includes the left-wing anti-Semitism that we are facing. Number one, the mutation of anti-Semitism is dependent on what is deemed as important in the time. The second tenet is that anti-Semitism is always contradictory. Woke left-wing anti-Semitism is not that different from classical anti-Semitism if you look closely. I'll start with the first tenet, mutation. So it is mutation that is based on what is deemed important of the time. That is how Jew hatred mutates. So from the times of Abraham, Jews, Hebrews were hated for embracing the oneness of God and rejecting idolatry. In the Middle Ages, Jews were hated for persecuting their religion. They were persecuted for killing a god. We know that's not true. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Jews were In the 19th and 20th centuries, Jews were persecuted for their race. Today, the Jews are persecuted for their nation state. The hatred remains the same, but it has adapted to a new language, a language of human rights and social justice. This is how it has mutated today. Who is the greatest enemy of human rights? What is the most important thing in our culture today? What is on trend? Human rights, social justice, and who are the biggest violator of that? Of course, the Jews. Before, when it was the Enlightenment period with Wilhelm Marr, what was in style at the time? What was the order of the world? It was science. So Jews were the inferior race. Scientifically, that's how they reasoned their Jew hatred. So we have to understand that this hatred morphs, but it remains the same. The second tenet is that it is always contradictory. The same kind of contradictory anti-Semitism that has existed throughout the centuries. It manifests itself on campuses, and let me give you a few examples of this left-wing anti-Semitism. Those shouting for a ceasefire are the same people at the rallies shouting for an intifada revolution. How can you want a ceasefire while calling for the death of Israelis? That sounds like a call to war, a call to violence. Those same people who shout free Palestine want to dismantle Israel, the only place in the region where Palestinians, Arab Israelis, enjoy complete freedom and equality under the law, where Arab Israelis serve in Knesset, in parliament, where they're doctors, where they're lawyers, where I even went to school with them at Tel Aviv University. These are the same people who shout to dismantle Israel. The contradiction. Shouldn't they care for Palestinians and their well-being? If you look at the region, Palestinians are best treated under Israeli sovereignty. Those on the left who believe all women suppress the voices of Israeli women raped on October 7th and turn a blind eye to Naama Levi, currently held hostage in Gaza. We all saw her bloody gray pants in that horrific and traumatic image as she was dragged into the van by 2 Hamas terrorists. Those who say the well-documented atrocities of October 7th didn't happen are the same people who say and who called the acts of genocide on October 7th resistance. Those same people who fight for human rights compare terrorists in Israeli prisons, people who have caused harm to civilians, to an actual civilian population, compare them to Israeli hostages who were stolen from their homes. There is clearly no moral equivalence, and the contradiction is apparent to anyone with a clear moral compass. Again, those who apparently are so concerned with proportionality and so attuned to a proportional response and butcher this legal concept argue that a small group of Israelis pulling down a Palestinian flag in Amsterdam merits a proportionate all-out pogrom lynch mob to be hunted in the street. Of course, we know that this is not the reason the lynch mob decided to persecute Jews in the streets of Amsterdam, because it was clear that this pogrom was premeditated and pre-planned. We see that the Uber drivers gave their locations. We see that they planned to attack them when they separated. They were hiding in alleys. So we see the second tenet of anti-Semitism, the contradiction. We see the moral fallacies. We see that it doesn't make sense. You're calling for a ceasefire, yet you're calling to globalize the Intifada. There's an incongruence here. So what do we learn from these contradictions? We understand that left-wing anti-Semitism is just like every other kind of anti-Semitism, that it's contradictory in nature. So, now that we know this, we know that it is much easier to defeat it. And how do we defeat it? I'll break down a few ways. First is with truth. Only truth, emet, is what we can use to combat the double standard. It is clear that a different standard, a set of rules, is set for Jews. And there's a word for that. It's called Jew hatred. And in this form of moral clarity, and it is important for us to have moral clarity when assessing this. And just to give a side note that's important, and it's ridiculous that this even has to be said, of course, criticizing Israel does not make you anti-Semitic. Jews are forced to say this humiliating statement every single time we talk about this, but it is obvious. Because if you know a Jewish person, you know that those who critique Israel the most is us. That's really what we do. We love to argue, we love to talk, and of course, criticizing Israel is not inherently anti-Semitic. It is actually, depending on how you do it, going to make Israel better if it's from a place of love. Natan Sharansky has a nice framework to determine when hatred of Israel and anti-Zionism becomes anti-Semitism. His framework is determined very simply by the 3 Ds. So first is the delegitimization of Israel. So if you ignore Israel's right to exist, the demonization of Israel, that is playing into old anti-Semitic tropes like Israel being bloodthirsty. Of course, we know that this is not true. Israel drops leaflets, opens humanitarian corridors, goes above and beyond the regular standard of what any army would do to protect civilian life. So the demonization of Israel, the delegitimization of Israel, and the last D from Natan Sharansky is the double standard. This one we see extremely apparently at the United Nations, how there's more General Assembly votes against Israel, who's compared to actual human rights violators like North Korea, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Pakistan, there's more UN General Assembly resolutions against Israel. This is a double standard that we see manifest itself in how Israel is not allowed to defend itself. Any other sovereign country whose borders were attacked has the right to defend itself, and especially the way that Israel is doing it in a proportionate manner. Israel is held to a double standard that no other country in the world is held to. So that's Natan Sharansky's 3 Ds of anti-Semitism and how it leads to anti-Zionism. And this is a good framework for how to talk about Israel and talk about Israeli policy specifically. But I have yet to see a specific Israeli policy criticized through the mainstream Palestinian movement and their chants. Okay, so now that we know that anti-Zionism is inherently anti-Semitic, let's dig a little deeper. And forgive me if it's a little bit of a repeat of last talk, but it's important to define the terms that we use. So anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism both in theory and in practice. So Zionism, as we already know, is the belief, it is the movement that Jews have the right to self-determination in our ancestral and indigenous homeland. This is a belief that has manifested through Zionism, through the decolonization of our land. Israel exists. It's no longer a question. Israel is here. Using language of Israel's right to exist, it's null. We're here. We exist. So, number one, in theory, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic, because if you deny Israel's right to exist, first of all, Israel already exists, and if you deny Zionism, it's also denying an integral part of Jewish identity. So anti-Zionism in practice is always anti-Semitic. Always, we see it, whether it is the 1 million Jews who were persecuted out of Arab lands, we see it on campus, we see it in how kosher food on campuses are banned under the guise of BDS. BDS is the boycott and divestment of sanctions of Israel. This is a tactic, an anti-colonial tactic that was appropriated from the South African boycotts in order to turn Israel to a pariah state. The goal of this tactic is to dismantle Israel and to turn Israel to a pariah state, and also to alienate Jewish students on campus. When you think about it, what does BDS do on campus, for example? Do universities really invest that much money in Israel? And if they do withdraw because of a student resolution, which normally they don't, will it actually affect Israel's economy in any way, shape, or form? The answer is no. So what does it affect? It affects Jews. It affects Jews because it attacks our connection to our indigenous land. And this kind of Jew hatred is a racist kind of Jew hatred. Ben Freeman has coined this term in his book, A Jewish Pride Rebuilding a People. So this brand of Jew hatred that seeks to eliminate integral aspects of our identity, whether it is our national component, like we see now, our connection to Israel, or whether it was in the time of Wilhelm Marr attacking our ethnic origins, we see that BDS falls in the same category because their goal is to eliminate the state of Israel. And that falls into Natan Sharansky's 3 Ds of the delegitimization of Israel. Their goal is not to create peace, is not to create justice. Their goal is to destroy Israel. They are not pro-Palestinian. They are anti-Israel. And I think that's one of the most important points in understanding. And that's one of the most important points in understanding left-wing anti-Semitism, is that left-wing anti-Semitism brands itself as some sort of moral movement, a movement that is fighting for human rights, a movement that is fighting for the underdog. But are they really fighting for the underdog, or do they just hate Israel? And I'll give you a few personal examples of how we see that it is just hating Israel. Last summer, I was on campus at McGill, and there was the pro-Palestinian encampment there. Students were on the front lawn at McGill. They had signs saying, globalize the Intifada. They had signs, in other words, calling for the death of Jews, of Israelis. I know people who died in the Intifada. We all know what Intifada means. We all know what Intifada looks like. And we all know what globalizing the Intifada is. So at this encampment, there was not any sign that spoke about Palestinians. Only signs and the only messages that were there were anti-Israel. We heard the slogans, min al-maya al-maya, Palestine Arabiya, from the water to the water. Palestine is Arab. We know that's a copy and paste from Hamas charter. This is not pro-Palestinian. This is simply anti-Israel. So I went to the campus with my friend, and we had two signs. One side that said, I witnessed October 7th, ask me anything. The second sign said, there is no future without Israelis and Palestinians on the land that we are from. Let's talk solutions. No Israeli flag. Two signs, the October 7th massacre of Jews, and one sign talking about creating a dialogue. Do you think that we were well received? No. But we went in with pure intentions, because we know that if there's going to be a change on the ground, it has to come from locals. It has to come from people who care about the conflict. But the left-wing anti-Semites don't care about Palestinians. They care about hating Israel and removing Israel from the map. So what happened was, we came with those signs and we were shouted at. We were violently shouted at. They told us to go back to where we came from. Go back to Europe. Do I look European? Not really. They told us that we don't belong here. Is that fighting for Palestinians? No. And here's where the second tenet of anti-Semitism comes in, the contradiction. If they were there to fight for Palestinians, should they not be interested in speaking with people who want to create and change the reality on the ground? No. They want to superimpose their idea of a solution on locals. They want to superimpose their beliefs onto us. And that is exactly what they claim to hate. They claim to hate whitewashing. They claim to hate imposing an imperial mindset. But what are they doing? They are neo-colonialists. They are imposing their view of how we should see the world, of who I am as a Jew indigenous to Israel, onto me. I'm a Levantine person. I am a Hebrew. I'm an Israelite. You're telling me to go back to Europe? You're telling me you care about Palestinians, that you speak over them? And if there's any Palestinians watching online, hopefully, I want to drive this point home. We all remember the Al-Ahli hospital propaganda that major news stations have put out, right? Remember when they blamed Israel for a Palestinian Islamic Jihad misfired rocket onto a hospital? Within moments, hundreds of people died. That was not true. Within moments, it was confirmed Israel did this. The second that it was known that it was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad misfired rockets onto the hospital, what happened? The left-wing anti-Semites went silent. Do they care about Palestinians, or do they care about using Palestinian suffering to hate Jews? The answer is obvious. So another example of this left-wing anti-Semitism that I really want to touch on, because it is a kind of anti-Semitism that tries to strip us of an integral part of our identity, is one that is very timely. I mentioned, and we all are horrified about the pogrom that happened in Amsterdam. We saw in the city where Anne Frank was hiding. Years later, on the anniversary of Kristallnacht, Jews, Israelis being told to hide in their hotels. Unsafe to get out. In a city where Anne Frank had to hide, again, Jews had to hide. But now, you would think that the Anne Frank Museum is a positive thing. People should go visit it and hear the story, right? But as Dara Horn writes in her book, she details this story. Dara Horn's book is an excellent book. I recommend everyone to read it. It's called People Love Dead Jews. Living ones, not so much. It talks about the story, it talks about the Anne Frank Museum, and how in 2018, somebody who worked at the Anne Frank Museum was told not to wear their kippah. Why? The answer given was, they shouldn't wear their kippah because they are a neutral space. They don't want to create a fuss. The Anne Frank Museum is making a Jew hide in 2018. This is not a coincidence. Let's dig deeper into this phenomenon, this cultural phenomenon. At the Anne Frank Museum, for tour guides and for people who want to follow the tour, there is a list of different countries with their languages. I think you know where I'm going with this. Of course, Hebrew is there. What flag is next to Hebrew? No flag. Every country had a flag but Israel. At the Anne Frank Museum, where she was hiding. What a disgrace. But I have to say, are we surprised? Yes, some are surprised. But when we understand that this type and this form of anti-Semitism, this left-wing anti-Semitism, it thrives in universalizing the Jewish story, in removing our particularness. It thrives on taking away a central tenet of who we are. The kippah was pretty obvious. They can't really stomach the idea of a Jew. But the Israeli flag, that is clear. We are Israel, we're not just pro-Israel. So that is what anti-Zionism looks like in practice. It's not about criticizing Israeli policies. It's about denying Jewish students the right to feel safe. It's about erasing elements of Jewishness. Israel, an integral element of Jewishness. It's about making Jewish students choose between the safety on their campus or the connection to Israel. It's about erasing an integral part of who we are. That's what it is. Now, moving forward, I also suggest, I think it's really important to talk about this other phenomenon within the left-wing movement, and that is the concept of Jews don't count. David Badiel argues this in his book. Although I disagree with his analysis, I think he has excellent examples of how Jews are continuously facing anti-Semitism from the left, yet the left is immune to understanding how. They think that if it's not right-wing anti-Semitism, then it's not anti-Semitism at all. Anti-Semitism is overlooked, and it is excused in progressive spaces because Jews are seen as powerful and we are seen as privileged. This perception leads to a dangerous double standard. Attacks on Jewish students, businesses, and synagogues are dismissed as political statements rather than hate crimes. When someone attacks a synagogue while chanting anti-Israel slogans, or Allahu Akbar, it is just anti-Zionism. It isn't anti-Semitism. The Jews, they merit it. They don't recognize that anti-Semitism is a pathology. It is a disease. It is a hating virus. Left-wing anti-Semitism sees Jew hatred as an effect. And if you dare call it out, you are bigoted. I want to give some hope, though. And the hope I'm going to give is that we can combat left-wing anti-Semitism. And the way that we do it is by sharing the truth, as I mentioned. And they will have their Entebbe moment. Let me explain to you what I mean by Entebbe moment. Hillel Neuer, someone who I really look up to, a mentor of mine, recently gave a talk, and he gave the example of Joschka Fischer. Joseph Martin Joschka Fischer was a German politician of the Alliance 90 and the Green Party. He served as the foreign minister and the vice chancellor of Germany in the cabinet of Schröder, sorry if I mispronounced that, from 1998 to 2005. And in 1969, Fischer was even photographed in Algeria at a meeting with the PLO, then still designated a terrorist organization. But he was part of the anti-fascist generation. His grandparents, his parents may have been Nazis, but him, no. He's liberated. He's different. Yet Fischer held many of the same anti-Semitic views and opinions that most left-wing anti-Semites hold today. But something changed. Fischer, who once supported the Free Palestine movement, of course we know that the Jews freed Palestine. If you see the Jewish art from JNF or the Jewish organizations before 1948, you would see the graphics calling Jews to come help free Palestine. That's actually a Jewish slogan, because before it was Jews who identified with the term, because it wasn't and it isn't an Arabic word. It is a region. It is a word to describe the region. Actually comes from the word Peleshet, but I'm getting sidetracked, so I'll bring back to the point. Why Joschka Fischer had his Entebbe moment. So Entebbe was the rescue mission officially known as the Operation Thunderbolt. It was a dramatic and a highly successful counterterrorism mission. It was when the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, in the July of 1976, July 4th to be exact, carried out a rescue mission where they rescued 102 hostages held by Palestinian terrorists and German militants at the Entebbe airport in Uganda. When Joschka Fischer saw that they were lining up who was Jewish and who was not Jewish, that was very reminiscent to the lines in Auschwitz. And suddenly, he had his moment. He had his Entebbe moment. So yes, it is possible to combat left-wing, woke anti-Semitism. But we have to be persistent in telling the truth and staying close to our narrative. I'm going to sum up this left-wing anti-Semitism through 4 points. Shani Moore and many scholars and historians have described this, but I like the way Shani has said it very succinctly. So number 1, anti-Semitism that doesn't come from white supremacists is fundamentally an expression of a grievance and not a pathology. A pathology being a deeply anti-Semitic, harmful belief, an unnatural belief stemming from deep-rooted, unhealthy biases. The second part of how left-wing, woke anti-Semitism functions is concern about anti-Semitism in itself is a form of racism. We see this with people like Roger Waters or others saying the most obnoxious thing ever. If you haven't been accused of anti-Semitism, are you really fighting for Palestine? Who has heard that? I have heard that one too many times. So we see that the concern for Jew hatred is in and of itself racism. How dare you stand up for the Jews? 3, Same
thing happened yesterday.
You guys can still hear me, no?
Yep.
So I'll continue? Okay. So 3 is the, okay. Okay, I'll go on. The show must go on. So 3. Muslim anti-Semitism is best understood as an effect and not a cause in both historical and current events. And what I mean by this is that when we talk about the 1948 narrative, we don't hear about the Mizrahi refugees, the 1 million of them. We don't hear about the Nabi Musa riots, the Hebron riots, where Jews were persecuted for being Jews in the land. This was before an alleged occupation of Jewish land in 1967 when we reclaimed the land in the 6-Day War. No. So number 3 is best understood as Jews being blamed for the hate that we face. Again, this is timely. I keep referencing Amsterdam because it is. I did not think I would have to speak about it here today, witnessing a program in 2024, but here we are. Amsterdam, they're saying hooligans who have ripped down Palestinian flags, they deserved it. They're chanting racist slogans. I know soccer players, I know the soccer teams. They're not exactly known for having the most polite way of polite chants. This is a universal issue within sports, within football, the racist chants. So a small group of people who don't represent the majority, which they seem to understand this concept very well, does not apply to Jews. It's always a cause. Like, to bring it back to what the Egyptian ambassador to the UN said, because of the state of Israel, Jews in Muslim countries will suffer. It's not because of the state of Israel. Because Jews are fighting for our rights does not mean that we deserve to face hate, because the hate was always there. Fourth, Jews who reject 1 to 3 of the points that I just listed are up to something, whether it is their wealth or they're silencing the souls who want to expose the Jewish lust to kill. That's how Shani Moore put it. Here we are. That is, all in all, those 4 points, how the woke anti-Semitism functions, how it looks like. And it is also manifested by its contradictory points and how it mutates. Of course, we also cannot ignore the fact that somehow there's a dissonance between left-wing anti-Semitism and Islamism. But this has been in the works for a long, long time. And when we study it, we begin to understand it. We all know about Mein Kampf. But did we know that the first translation of Mein Kampf was in Arabic? Wow. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem was allied with Hitler. He represented the Arabs of the region. There was a radio called the Arab Voice of Berlin. This radio was all about Nazi propaganda before the State of Israel in Arabic. So this has been in the works for a very long time. Now, I touched on this a bit before, but I have to say it again with another example that is extremely powerful. There is nothing more than a left-wing anti-Semite hates than Jews, Israelis, and Palestinians coming together. And we see this when they push BDS. What was the biggest fail or the biggest success of BDS in their eyes? SodaStream. They managed to take out SodaStream from the West Bank, from Judea and Samaria. What did that do in practice? Israelis, they survived, they got jobs. Pepsi Cola bought out SodaStream, they're making bank, they're good. Who suffered? The Arabs suffered. They lost their jobs. SodaStream and the Israelis, they were just fine. Initiatives that bring locals together, that ignore their view, their Western outlook of what it is in the Middle East, also irritates them. Because they try to use anti-colonial tactics like the South African boycotts to superimpose that onto Israel to hopefully, in their mind, make Israel be dismantled, which will never happen, or through armed resistance like the Algerian struggle against the French. What they don't know and they don't realize is that anti-colonial tactics do not work on an indigenous people. The people of Israel, when faced with these tactics, only come closer to who we are, and it fuels the conflict. So when they're coming from this left-wing perspective of anti-colonialism, they have not yet realized that the Jews have decolonized our land. And if we want justice in the land for both people, and if they really do care to fight for Palestinians like they say they are, then they would encourage discussions and empower the voices on the ground. And, empower the voices on the ground. When I was in Israel, I worked with an organization called Habayit, the Home. My friend Inon is an incredible activist. He works with Palestinians in creating dialogue. He actually has to protect them because it is very risky for them to speak to Jews in their communities in the West Bank. They might be shunned, might not be welcomed. We hide their faces when we do videos, if we do videos, just to have the dialogue. So I went with Inon, my colleague and my friend, to Sheikh Jarrah. Sheikh Jarrah is close to Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, but for us as Jews, we consider Sheikh Jarrah to be Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik was one of the last judges in the assembly, in the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah. So many Jews feel connected because his tombstone is there, and many Jews, Sephardic Jews, would go have a pilgrimage there, and there was a community there. So there is a land dispute in this area. When I went to go create dialogue with Palestinians who are also part of the Abrahamic family and who I want to make peace with because those are the people who we have to be speaking with to change the reality on the ground, I had bamba, Israeli chips, an Israeli snack. And there was this little boy who approached me and I offered him. He was laughing with me, sticking out his tongue. For him, he was on the other side, but this kid reminded me of my nephews. I love my nephews. Anyone who knows that knows I love them. Shout out to Gabriel. He reminded me of my nephews, and it was a cute moment. What happened? A left-wing anti-Semite who allegedly cares about Palestinians immediately got so enraged, red, foaming at the mouth, blue. She grabbed this kid's arm, and yanked him, whispered in his ear, and scared the hell out of him. And I was like, do you think that's going to bring justice? Do you think that's going to make a difference? Absolutely not. So the way to combat left-wing, woke anti-Semitism is by empowering Jews and Palestinians to come closer together. Because so long as they think that they get to dictate to us what our story is, calling me a Jew indigenous to Israel to go back to Europe, calling Jews colonizers to the land that we are from, erasing an integral part of our identity, that won't work. It starts by amplifying Jewish voices, standing with the truth, so they can have their Entebbe moment. And in closing, let me leave you with this. The fight against anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is a fight for justice, a fight for truth. It is the fight for our people to live freely in our ancestral and indigenous homeland. This is a righteous fight, and it's a fight we can only win if we stand together. Jews and non-Jews, Israelis and Palestinians, students, community members, and together we can push back against the rising tide of hatred and build a future where Israelis and Palestinians can live together and where we can debunk this notion of us being so different and us having to listen to the left-wing anti-Semites define Jewish identity, define what it's like to be in Israel, and define the conflict that they know nothing about. So privileged. I think we could open up to questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank
I have
you.
a few questions for you. Vi har fått inn flere spørsmål enn vi har tid til, så det blir noen av de. Så da får dere ikke bli fornærmet hvis ikke akkurat deres spørsmål kommer igjennom. The first question is, how did you become an activist for your own people?
That's a great question. It's also my least favorite question. I'll tell you why. Because, yes, I'm an activist, but I'm a Jew. I'm an active Jew. I am blessed to have grown up with the best parents ever. They have raised me with such profound Jewish identity, ideals. My mom sent me to the best Hebrew school with my dad. Well, I say my parents, but my mom chose the school. She sat down with me and studied Hebrew, the Aleph Bet. She didn't know it. She didn't have a Jewish education, but she wanted to make sure that I did. My father didn't either, and at the age of 60, he taught himself how to read Hebrew. And I grew up in a home where I was made to feel proud. And because of that pride, I started doing movement, I started being more active in my community. When I was 13 years old, I was part of my local synagogue, C-Teen, and we would do IDF drives to raise money for Israel. I was obsessed. I just wanted to give back to my people. When I would hear about the Maccabees and I would hear about Jerusalem, I would think, wow, these are my ancestors, like what a powerful story. I'm a link in a chain. I want to make Aliyah and live in Israel, because to be in Israel is to be a free Jew. We're the next generation of Jews. I want to participate. And I was always involved. And I guess that my activism started by being an active Jew and not an advocate, an active Jew, by taking grassroots actions, posting online, and shifting the narrative. Because I'm not a Jewish advocate, I'm more of an activist.
Is there any difference between anti-Semitism in... No? Is there any difference between anti-Semitism in the United States and Canada on campuses and educational institutions? And how are the teachers understanding attitudes towards the conflict?
So in Canada and in the United States, the way and the tactics that pro-Palestinian movements utilize and leverage are very similar. So they'll use tactics like anti-normalization, trying to ban Jewish students from engaging with anyone who's pro-Palestinian by trying to boycott Jewish lectures, by trying to eliminate aspects of our identity, by trying to disenfranchise Jewish students, to turn them into aliens on campus. So those tactics from pro-Palestinian groups that view us as a caricature of what it means to be a Jew and not as the indigenous people that we are quite similar. Unfortunately, we see that oftentimes on campus, teachers enable that because they're not getting this information from the clear blue sky. They're getting it from the professors. And oftentimes students on campus do not feel comfortable writing the paper that they want to write. They don't feel comfortable expressing their Judaism. And when I say Judaism, I mean literally our civilization, who we are. I would say that in Montreal, it's the only place where it's slightly different, because in Montreal, there's a French influence, and it looks a little bit more like France, because we see the kind of anti-Semitism that I was discussing, the kind of anti-Semitism that looks like hating Jews because of their national identity, but there's a religious component to it. You know, like I've heard the word Yahud be used as a slur. So there's also that racial aspect to it. Like we saw again, I keep mentioning this in the Amsterdam pogrom, that was a racial attack.
Thank you. How can young students who are Jews or Zionists by choice stand up for themselves on campuses when they are surrounded by anti-Semites who invoke ideologies, and doing so without losing their identity?
You answer the question with your question. They do so by having their identity, by being proud of their identity. Jews are not here to be anti-Semites. We're here to be Jews. That's an excellent quote by Barry Weiss. So the best way to combat anti-Semitism, the only way, and the best antidote is to be proud Jews, to stay connected. That's the only way. And another thing I want to mention is that our calls to action are often misinformed. It's not the deans of universities that are going to stand up for Jews or tell our story. It's not our professors. It's not the judges in a lawsuit. It's up to us to tell our story. It's up to Jews to tell our story. And it's up to non-Jewish allies in this room to amplify it. That's what we have to do, not to hide, and to direct our calls to actions towards ourselves. That's a more empowered mindset, to not have a Hajj Magen David mentality, because if you hide, you lose your rights. If you don't use them, you lose them. And this new status quo is accepted.
And a short final question. Do you have a plan to do Aliyah?
For sure.
Yeah. You know anything about when?
My mother's in the crowd. So,
she doesn't want you to go yet?
So, great question. For me, I already made Aliyah. It's a piece of paper. You know, it was very clear in the past what a passport was for a Jew. Anything can happen overnight. To me, in my mind, I know that I'm a Jew. I know where I'm from. I'm deeply connected to the land. I'm in Israel all the time. And right now, I have a mission in the diaspora. I think the Jewish time in diaspora should be temporary, and my temporary mission is to pass the bar exam and then go back home.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much
Thank
for
you so
joining us.
much.
It's been really nice to listen
Thank
to
you so much. It's a
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Shashke. I got it right, the name. Great, thank you. Okay.